There was a lot of talk in the election, wasn't there, about people's attitude and approaches to immigration. Nigel Farage, for example, said that this was going to be the immigration election. Well, I think actually Labour talked quite tough on this, and one of the things that they were saying is that they were essentially going to try and crack down on foreign workers, and it was going to be one of their priorities. Well, of course, we've got the King's Speech tomorrow, and it now doesn't seem that this plan of Labour's is going to be contained within it. It's going to be delayed. What do you think to this?
Well, none of Labour's plans on immigration are going to work. I mean, Labour talked a good talk during the election campaign. They said they were going to smash the gangs, they were going to stop the illegal migration crisis at the border. They talked about lowering legal net migration, but they're already backtracking on some of the policies that they suggested they were going to bring forward, like, for example, clamping down on firms hiring overseas workers if they don't pay the minimum wage. And wherever you look with the Labour Party and migration policy, it's set up to fail. I mean, take the illegal migration issue, the small boats. Labour said it's going to smash the gangs and set up a new border patrol command centre, which we basically already have, while it's going to remove the Rwanda plan and the deterrent, which would discourage other people from coming over, and it's going to overturn Rishi Sunak's Illegal Migration Act, which allowed us essentially to move quicker and faster and deport illegal migrants in the country. And Labour have said they're basically going to give an amnesty to 100,000 plus illegal migrants in the country. What we're seeing, Michelle, is the beginning of a much more liberal, laissez-faire approach to migration at exactly the same time as millions of people out there in the country become more concerned about the immigration crisis, become more sceptical about the effects of immigration on the country, and become more supportive of parties like Reform, led by people like Nigel Farage, who are basically saying, look, we need to get a grip on this because it's completely out of control. And it is out of control, because if you look at the ONS figures that came out yesterday, and I know you talked briefly about them on your show yesterday, I mean, the numbers are bananas. We are living through the biggest increase in our population since 1948, when troops came back from World War II and we had a baby boom shortly after World War II. The key difference, of course, is the population increase today isn't because of British people coming back. It isn't because of British families having more kids. It's because of mass immigration. That's why our population is growing at the quickest rate since 1948. So if we don't get our arms around this, I'm worried, Michelle, that we're going to have a much bigger problem.
What do you think, Kerry?
Well, I think Labour's always posed as the friend of migrants and friend of refugees, but I think it's always been talking the talk and using it to batter white working class people in Britain. So I don't have much sympathy for Labour. And I think their policy idea, which they've now ditched for the King's Speech tomorrow, was actually passing the buck anyway. So it was making employers have to deal with it rather than the government have to deal with it. And I also think that it's very convenient for a government that wants to sound good and friendly and so politically correct to not have to deal with upskilling workers in Britain, to not have to deal with the housing crisis, and to allow elite to go on poaching doctors and people from the poorest countries on earth, which I think is scandalous and doesn't help either refugees or the population in Britain. I'm very pro-immigration in terms of our ability to move freely around the world, but I don't think people should be dumped on, and I think it should be a matter of democratic decision-making, and Labour doesn't try and do any of those things.
Well, just briefly on that, I do think the key point is there is no democratic mandate for the policy of mass immigration. There isn't.
I know.
Successive governments on both the left and the right for the last 25, 30 years have said we will lower overall levels of migration into the country, and then they've done the opposite. They've treated voters with contempt, and then they sit around and say, gee, I wonder why Reform are getting 4 million votes, or I wonder why support for the two big parties just fell to its lowest level for 100 years. It's because what we're doing through mass immigration is we're basically giving the British people managed decline is what's happening. More pressure on the NHS, more pressure on public services. We're fueling the housing crisis. Everybody likes to talk about planning reform. They don't talk about surging demand, which is coming through migration. And to be blunt, we are weakening the social cohesion of our country, because a lot of the people who are coming in now are coming from outside of Europe, different values, different ways of life, different histories, different religions. No nation state has ever gone through the speed and scale of demographic change that we are going through currently and come out on the other side as a healthy, prosperous, socially cohesive society hasn't happened.
I'm almost loath to mention this because I think this fella's got a bit of a cheek, actually, talking about immigration. But Tony Blair, he has been speaking out and he's warned Keir Starmer, and I quote, to close off the avenues of the populist right by keeping tough controls on immigration. I say he's got a cheek because I think a lot of the immigration that we see, it happened under Tony Blair's watch anyway. But also, when you look at some of his ridiculous, disastrous war policies, that's one of the reasons that people are fleeing some of these countries. But anyway, this whole notion that you are somehow this kind of populist, right-leaning lunatic, if you have the audacity to want to have control of your country's borders, I find it quite frankly insulting.
Well, it's how people on the left try and control the national conversation, because what they do is they expand these words like far right, hate, populism, and they try and discredit what are entirely legitimate views held by a large majority of the country. I actually think Blair is right to say to the Labour Party, if you don't actually get serious about dealing with mass immigration and the illegal migration invasion on the borders, you're going to have a massive problem. He's right on that. And I do think politicians can change their minds, and I think Blair has clearly changed his mind on mass migration. He's also been very critical of the woke because he thinks that hurts the left. But
I don't agree at all. Blair has always used immigration either, as I was saying, to bash white working class people as always one step away from racist, violent hysteria, which is actually what you're suggesting and what he's saying to Starmer. Get a grip on this, or look what these bigots will do. That's what he's saying.
No, I'm not suggesting.
I know you're not suggesting that, but that's what I wouldn't stick up for Blair at all in relation to this. He's used immigration to police the white working class and make out that we have mass potential bigotry on the horizon, which is rubbish. I also think we should be careful, and I wouldn't trust Labour on this at all, is to not play the kind of neo-Malthusian numbers game and tell people that if we reduce the numbers, the economy will grow, because there's nothing inherent in that at all. And we should also be honest that people are not just consumers of resources, they're also creators. That's not to say there isn't a numbers problem in terms of migrants coming in because of the lack of integration, assimilation, our inability to stand up for British values, and our attempt to call British working class people racist. So there is a problem, but it isn't a population numbers problem.
Of course it's a population problem.
Well, that's not causing the crisis that we're in or an unproductive British economy, is it?
Well, it's not either or. If we have the biggest population increase that we've had in 75 years, while trying to manage a housing crisis, while trying to fix the NHS, while trying to improve public services, while trying to ensure British kids can get places at British schools, of course the size of the population matters. What we are going through is the biggest increase in the population we've had really since the late 40s. Natural change in our population in terms of births being greater than deaths. Last year added 400 people net to the population. Immigration added 600,000. So the size of the population matters. And if you look at where we're going if we don't change track, and I keep pointing this out, I write about this all the time, the next 12 years, we're going to have 6.5 million more people in this country, which is basically 70% of a city the size of London, 6.1 million of those because of migration. Migration is going to be 90% of our population growth over the next 12 years. Nobody in Westminster is talking about this. Nobody is saying, well, how is this going to impact the housing crisis? How's this going to impact the NHS? I was in A&E recently trying to figure, with my daughter, just looking around. I mean, none of our public services are working, but you're not allowed to say this is, mass immigration is a contributing factor to that, because that is considered to be somehow socially unacceptable. And if you look at countries around the world that used to be liberal on these issues, take Canada. Even Canada now, even Justin Trudeau has come out and said the population explosion is unsustainable because it's what's called the population trap. And that is a crucial point. When your population gets so big, the state can no longer provide basic services to its citizens. And that is why, when you look around Britain today, trains not working, NHS not working, can't get a GP's appointment, your kids can't get on the housing ladder, you don't feel safe, women are getting sexually harassed and leered at in London. there's violence on the streets, lots of people in our country don't share our values. That is what I'm talking about. We are entering a population trap where the state can no longer provide basic services because our population is too big, and it's also, I would argue, becoming too diverse. You need a shared set of values and a shared identity to make a society function. And I think, personally, we are losing that shared sense of unity.